22 years old, $43 in a coffee can, a duffel bag with 2 shirts, a phone with a cracked screen, and a photograph of a mother she couldn't remember the sound of anymore. That was what Ruth Calloway had left in the world the day the letter arrived. The lighthouse was already old when her grandfather bought the keeper's cottage attached to it, and it had been abandoned longer than Ruth had been alive. She didn't know that yet. She only knew the envelope in her hands, postmarked from a county 300 miles north, addressed to a woman named Ruth Calloway who, according to the letter inside, was the sole surviving heir of a man named Elias Whitlock. She had never heard the name before in her life. The lamp-room door had been welded half shut by rust, and behind it, tucked into the base of the old fog signal cabinet, was a lockbox no key on her ring would open. She didn't know what was inside it yet either. She would find out. But not today. Today she was still 3 weeks from standing in that room at all, and there was a great deal she didn't understand about the property she now, somehow, owned outright for $1 in unpaid county fees. $1. She'd read the figure 4 times before she believed it. She'd grown up thinking money like that only existed in stories other people told, the kind where somebody's whole life turned on a single stroke of luck. She had never once imagined that somebody could be her. Maybe you've had a year like the one Ruth was coming out of. Maybe you know what it is to run every number twice before you buy groceries, to sleep with one eye on the exit, to have nowhere in particular to be, and nowhere in particular to go back to. If you do, you already understand something about Ruth before we even get to the lighthouse. And if you don't, stay with her a while. By the end of this, I think you'll understand her anyway. I'm glad you're here, by the way. If stories like this one are the kind of thing that helps you slow down at the end of a long day, go ahead and subscribe. It just means there'll be more of them waiting for you. Ruth had aged out of the foster system at 18, with a garbage bag of clothes and a caseworker's business card she never called. 4 years since then had taught her how to disappear into a room, how to make a granola bar last a whole afternoon, how not to ask anyone for anything. She'd been sleeping in her car outside a laundromat in Ohio when the letter found her, forwarded twice, creased down the middle, addressed to a shelter she'd left almost a year earlier. Somebody there had known where to send it. She never found out who. The letter said Elias Whitlock was her mother's uncle. Ruth's mother had died when Ruth was 6. No one had ever mentioned an Elias. No one had ever mentioned much of anything. Her mother's side of the family had gone quiet, the way a house goes quiet, when everyone in it has decided not to speak to each other again. And Ruth had grown up in the silence, without ever being told why. She almost threw the letter away. She didn't, in the end, because throwing it away cost something she didn't have to spare, and because the alternative, driving 300 miles on $43 of gas money to see a lighthouse she'd never heard of, cost less than staying still. The drive took her up along a coastline that turned grayer and colder the farther north she went, past towns that thinned out into gas stations and bait shops, until the road narrowed to gravel, and then to little more than a suggestion, and there, at the end of a spit of land the map barely acknowledged, stood the lighthouse. It was not what she'd pictured. Whatever she'd pictured had been better than this. The tower itself still stood, white paint gone grey, and peeling in long strips like bark off a birch. One window boarded over, a crack running up from the base, like a fault line waiting to finish what it started. The keeper's cottage beside it had a roof that sagged in the middle, the way an old mattress does, and the whole property was fenced in by knee-high grass that hadn't been cut in years, moving now in a wind that came straight off the water and didn't stop for anything. She stood at the gate for a long time before she went in. There was a smell to the place, salt and rust, and something green and wet underneath it, the smell of a building that had spent years arguing with the ocean and losing slowly. Somewhere out past the rocks, a bellboy rang, flat and irregular, like it was keeping time for no one. She almost turned around. She stood there with her hand still on the gate, telling herself this had been a mistake, that whatever waited past that door was somebody else's ruin and none of her business, and that she should get back in the car and drive back to a life that at least she understood the shape of. She didn't leave, though. She had nowhere particular to drive back to. That was the truth of it, plain as the wind. The front door of the cottage wasn't locked, hadn't been locked in years, from the look of the frame, and it swung in on a room thick with dust and the ghost shapes of furniture under sheets. A woman's voice startled her from the doorway behind, an older voice, unimpressed and a little amused. "You're the granddaughter, then?" Ruth turned. A woman stood at the edge of the yard in a canvas coat, arms crossed, looking at her the way you'd look at a stray dog that had wandered in. Not unkind, exactly, just deciding what to make of it. "I don't know what I am," Ruth said. It was the truest thing she'd said out loud in a while. The woman's name was Dot Pruitt, and she ran the general store 4 miles down the only road that led anywhere, and she had known Elias Whitlock for 40 years, and she was already shaking her head slowly at the state of the place, like she'd expected exactly this, and was disappointed anyway. "He kept to himself," Dot said, "especially at the end. Nobody out here really knew what he had, or what he didn't." She looked at Ruth a moment longer than was comfortable. "You didn't know him at all, did you?" "No. That's a shame," Dot said. "He talked about family, sometimes, near the end." She didn't say more than that, and something in the way she stopped herself told Ruth there was more to say. Ruth walked the property alone once Dot had gone, boots loud on the gravel, and stopped at the base of the tower, where the door to the lamp-room stairs stood half open, hanging crooked on one hinge. Cold air came down out of the stairwell, like breath from something underground. She didn't go up, not yet. She told herself it was because the light was failing and the stairs looked unsafe, and both of those things were true, but neither of them was the real reason, and she knew it, even as she told herself otherwise. She spent that first night in the car in the driveway, engine off, coffee can of cash on the passenger seat, listening to the bellboy and the wind working at the loose boards on the cottage roof, and somewhere above her, at the top of a lighthouse she now owned and understood nothing about, a locked cabinet sat exactly where it had sat for longer than she'd been alive, waiting on a woman who didn't yet know it was waiting for her at all. Ruth woke to gulls arguing somewhere close and a stiff neck from sleeping folded against the driver's side window. The light coming over the water was the color of weak tea, and for a moment, still half asleep, she forgot where she was, and then she remembered, and sat up, and looked at the lighthouse like it might have changed its mind overnight about being real. It hadn't. She got out and stretched, joints popping, and made herself walk the property again in daylight, before she let herself think too hard about what came next. The keeper's cottage looked worse in full sun. She could see now that the sag in the roofline wasn't cosmetic, that water had gotten in somewhere and taken its time about doing damage. But the walls were stone at the base, thick and solid, older than the wood framing above them, and something about that steadiness settled her a little. Whatever else was wrong with this place, it hadn't been built by somebody careless. She found a hand pump well around the side, half buried in weeds, and worked the handle out of habit more than hope. It groaned, resisted, and then coughed out a thread of rust-colored water that ran clear after a minute. She stood there longer than she needed to, just watching it run, like it was the first good news she'd gotten in longer than she could remember. Dot's store was the only building on the road with its lights on, a low clapboard place with a hand-painted sign and a bell over the door that announced Ruth before she'd finished stepping inside. Dot didn't look up from the register. "Didn't expect you back so soon," she said. "Most people take one look and drive off." "I don't have anywhere else to drive to," Ruth said, and immediately wished she hadn't, because it was too honest for a conversation about groceries. Dot did look up then. Something shifted in her face. Not pity exactly, more like recalculation. "There's a hardware place 2 towns over, does contractor discounts," she said. "But you'll want Jean first. Man's fixed half the roofs on this stretch of coast, when he's sober enough to climb one, which is most days now. Tell him I sent you. He won't overcharge you if I sent you." "Why would you do that?" Dot rang up the coffee and bread Ruth had set on the counter, without really deciding to buy them. "Because Elias was a strange, stubborn old man who didn't talk to hardly anybody the last 10 years of his life," she said, "and you're the only piece of him that walked back into this town since he died. That's reason enough for some of us." "Some of us?" Ruth turned the phrase over as she carried her bag back down the road. It implied there were others who felt differently, and she found herself wondering, not for the first time since the letter arrived, exactly what kind of man Elias Whitlock had been, and why the family that never mentioned him had gone quiet the way they had. Jean turned out to be a broad, sun-cracked man in his 60s, with a limp he didn't explain, and a truck older than Ruth. He walked the cottage roof with his hands in his pockets, muttering, and pronounced it bad, not hopeless, which Ruth decided to take as good news. He wouldn't take payment for the assessment. "Elias helped me out of a bad patch once," he said, like that settled something, and didn't elaborate, and Ruth noted, the way she was starting to note most things out here, that everyone in this town seemed to be carrying around half a story about her grandfather and offering her only the other half. The days that followed fell into a rough, aching shape. She learned to patch a roof section under Jean's direction, her hands blistering in places they'd never blistered before. She learned which floorboards in the cottage held weight and which didn't. She hauled 2 generations of water-damaged furniture out to a burn pile at the property's edge and found, halfway through a rotted armchair, a coffee tin full of rusted keys that fit no lock she'd found yet. She set it on the kitchen counter and kept working, but she didn't stop thinking about it. She went up into the lamp room on the 4th day, finally, climbing the spiral stair, with her heart going harder than the climb accounted for. The room at the top was small, glass-walled, floor gritty, with old gull droppings and broken glass from a pane that had given out years back. The great lens sat dark and dull with salt film, and beneath the old fog signal housing in the corner, bolted into the floor itself, sat a metal cabinet with a heavy padlock that none of the rusted keys downstairs came close to matching. She crouched in front of it for a long while, the wind coming steady through the broken pane, and did not touch it. It could wait. She told herself that, and mostly believed it, and went back down the stairs to keep patching the roof before the next rain came in. That evening, sitting on the cottage steps with a cup of Jean's terrible coffee, she asked him straight out, because she was tired of half-stories, what had happened between her grandfather and the rest of the family. Jean was quiet a long moment, looking out at the water going purple with the last light. "Not my story to tell," he said finally, "but I'll say this. Whatever went wrong between them, your grandfather spent the last years of his life talking like a man trying to fix something he'd run out of time to fix." He glanced at her sideways. "You might find you're not as unrelated to all this as you think." He wouldn't say more than that, no matter how she pushed, and she went to sleep that night in the one dry corner of the cottage, with the coffee tin of keys on the floor beside her, and the locked cabinet in the lamp room, sitting dark and patient, 200 steps above her head. The first real trouble came from a man named Cal Draper, who ran the marina at the harbour mouth and had, according to Dot, opinions about everything, and standing to back up maybe half of them. He found Ruth at the hardware store in the next town over, recognized her from a description Dot must have given half the county by then, and didn't bother introducing himself before he started talking. "You're the one squatting out at the Whitlock light." "I'm not squatting," Ruth said. "I own it. That's what I hear." Cal had the look of a man who'd spent 40 years on the water and let it weather every inch of him. Funny thing, though, Elias Whitlock had a sister. Sister had kids. None of them ever came around while the old man was alive, and now here's a granddaughter nobody's ever heard of, showing up right after he's dead, inheriting the one piece of property on this coast that's actually worth something under all that rot. Worth something, Ruth repeated. It's falling apart. The land's not falling apart, Cal said. 2 acres of waterfront with lighthouse rights attached. You know what that parcel's zoned for if somebody ever decided to develop it. He shook his head like she'd confirmed something he already suspected. Just seems awful convenient is all I'm saying. Man dies alone, and a stranger inherits. Ruth felt her face go hot. He was my great-uncle. So you say. She didn't have an answer for that. Not because it wasn't true, but because she'd never actually seen proof beyond a lawyer's letter and a county filing, and standing there in the fluorescent light of the hardware store, she realized she didn't fully understand her own claim to the place any better than Cal did. It was the first time since arriving that the ground under her had felt less than solid, and it lodged in her like a splinter she couldn't quite reach. She drove back to the lighthouse with the radio off, turning it over. None of them ever came around while the old man was alive. Why not? What had happened between Elias and the rest of the family that had cost them not just a relationship, but, apparently, decades of silence, deep enough that Ruth herself had grown up, not even knowing her great-uncle existed. She thought of the coffee tin of keys on the kitchen counter. She thought of the locked cabinet in the lamp room. She thought of Jean saying you might find you're not as unrelated to all this as you think, and wondered, not for the first time, if he'd meant something more specific than she'd assumed. That night, she went through the cottage more carefully than she had before. Not cleaning this time, but looking. In a drawer under a warped window seat, she found a shoebox of photographs, water-stained at the edges, most of them too damaged to make out. But one survived clearer than the rest. A young woman standing in front of the lighthouse, squinting into the sun, maybe 20 years old, wearing a dress Ruth's own mother had worn in a photo Ruth kept folded in her wallet. She was almost sure of it, though she couldn't check without driving somewhere with better light. On the back, in pencil so faded, she had to tilt it to the window to read it. E. and M. Summer. M. Not a name she recognized, but the resemblance to her mother's photo nagged at her all evening, and she found herself returning to it 3 or 4 times before she made herself put the shoebox away and go to sleep. Rain came in overnight, hard and sideways, the kind of storm that found every gap Jean hadn't gotten to yet. Ruth spent 2 in the morning with a bucket under a new leak in the cottage ceiling, exhausted and furious and, for the first time since she'd arrived, seriously questioning whether she'd made a mistake, driving 300 miles for a ruin and a town full of people who either wouldn't tell her anything or accused her of lying about who she was. By the time the rain broke toward dawn, she'd made a decision. She would ask Dot directly, not for the general shape of a story anymore, but for names. Whatever had happened between Elias and the family, somebody in this town had to know the specifics, and she was done being handed pieces. Dot, when Ruth cornered her the next morning, went quiet in a way that told Ruth she'd struck something real. "There was a falling out," Dot said finally, wiping down the counter without looking up. "Before you were born." "I don't know all of it. Elias never told the whole thing to anybody, far as I know. But there was a woman. Somebody he loved and lost, in a way that had something to do with your family and something to do with money, and he never really came back from it the way people expect a person to." She set the rag down. "That photo you found, was there a name on the back?" Ruth's stomach turned over. "How did you know about the photo?" "I didn't," Dot said. "Lucky guess. And the look on your face just now." She studied Ruth a long moment. "Whatever this is, it's older than you, and it's tangled up in more than an old lighthouse. You might want to brace yourself before you keep pulling on that thread." Ruth walked back to the property with the rain-soaked morning going grey and close around her, Cal Draper's suspicion sitting in her chest, alongside Dot's warning, and stopped at the base of the tower, looking up at the lamp-room window 200 steps above. Whatever was in that cabinet, she was starting to understand, wasn't just money. She climbed the stairs before she could talk herself out of it, and stood again in front of the locked cabinet, the coffee tin of mismatched keys in her hand. And this time, instead of walking away, she got down on her knees and started, one by one, trying them. None of them fit. Not one. She sat back against the cold stone wall, breathing hard, more from frustration than exertion, and noticed, for the first time, a second, smaller keyhole set into the side panel of the cabinet, nearly hidden under a film of rust. Not the same lock as the padlock at all. A different mechanism entirely. Older. The kind of lock that wanted a key nobody had made in 100 years. Whatever waited inside, it wasn't going to give itself up easily. She didn't sleep much that night, turning the second keyhole over in her mind the way she'd turned over Cal's suspicion and Dot's warning. A lock like that wasn't hardware store stock. It was old enough that whatever key fit it had likely been made specifically for that cabinet, which meant it was somewhere on the property, if it existed at all. She started with the obvious places and worked outward. The kitchen drawers, the window seat where she'd found the photographs, a toolbox in the lean-to shed out back, full of rusted hand tools and a wasp nest she disturbed and immediately regretted. Nothing. Jean showed up mid-morning to finish the roof section they'd started before the storm, and found her on her knees in the shed, elbow deep in a crate of what turned out to be old fishing tackle. "Lose something?" "A key," she said, not looking up. "For a cabinet in the lamp room. Second lock, smaller than the padlock." She glanced at him. "You wouldn't happen to know anything about that?" Something crossed his face, quick, gone before she could name it. "Can't say I do," he said, which was, she was beginning to recognize, the exact tone people in this town used when they meant, "I know something, but it isn't mine to give you." "Jean, I fixed roofs for the man," he said. "I didn't keep his secrets. If he had one worth keeping, he kept it himself." He picked up his hammer and headed back toward the ladder, and that was the end of it, though Ruth noticed he didn't quite meet her eyes on the way past. She gave up on the shed by early afternoon and turned to the cottage itself, room by room, more methodically this time, not just looking for damage to repair, but looking, really looking, at what the place had to tell her. In the back bedroom, under a loose section of baseboard she'd nearly overlooked while checking for water damage, she found a small metal strongbox, unlocked, containing not a key, but a stack of letters tied with kitchen twine, the paper gone soft and brown at the folds. Her hands were shaking a little as she untied them. Most were ordinary. Receipts, a few letters from a shipping company about lighthouse supply deliveries decades old, dry and administrative. But near the bottom of the stack was one in different handwriting, looping and unfamiliar, addressed simply to E, no last name, no return address. She unfolded it carefully, the paper threatening to tear along its old creases. "E, I know you think I left because I stopped caring, but that's not true and never was. What happened with the money was not your doing, whatever they've told you, and whatever they've told you since. You did nothing wrong, except love people who couldn't forgive you for a mistake that wasn't yours to carry. I hope one day there's someone left who can see that clearly, even if I can't be the one to say it to your face." M. Ruth read it 3 times. M, the same initial as the photograph. Whatever had happened between Elias and this woman, this M, it tangled with money, and with blame, and with a family that had apparently decided, long before Ruth was born, that Elias was the one at fault for something he might not have actually done. She thought of her own mother, dead 11 years now, and the wall of silence Ruth had grown up inside without ever understanding its shape. She thought of the resemblance in the photograph that she still hadn't been able to confirm. A small, cold thought surfaced, one she wasn't ready to look at directly yet. What if the family Cal Draper accused her of not really belonging to was a family that had wronged Elias, not the other way around? And what if that wrong was the reason nobody had ever spoken his name to her at all? She went looking for Dot again that evening, letter in her coat pocket, and found the store already closed, lights off, a hand-lettered sign in the window announcing a family emergency 2 towns over. It would be 3 days before Dot was back. Ruth stood on the dark porch a long moment, feeling the specific, familiar ache of a door closing on an answer she badly needed, and walked home in the dark with only the bellboy for company. That night, unable to sleep, she went up to the lamp room one more time, letter in hand, and sat on the cold floor across from the locked cabinet, as if proximity to it might make the second keyhole confess something. It didn't, but sitting there, lamp room glass rattling faintly in the wind, she noticed something she'd missed in her earlier visits. Scratched into the underside of the fog signal housing above the cabinet, faint enough that she had to angle her phone flashlight sideways across it to catch the shadow of the marks at all. Not words. A crude diagram, a small square, and beside it 3 notches, like tally marks, and an arrow pointing toward the base of the tower itself. She didn't know what it meant, but it was the first thing on this whole property that felt less like an accident of decay and more like something left deliberately. A message, maybe, or a map, or nothing at all. She photographed it before her hands got too cold to hold the phone steady and climbed back down the stairs with the letter still folded in her pocket, the strongbox letters waiting on the kitchen table, and a small, stubborn, unfamiliar feeling starting to work its way up through the exhaustion and doubt of the last week. It wasn't hope yet. Not quite, but it was close enough to it that she recognized the shape. Whatever Elias Whitlock had lost, and whatever he'd been blamed for, she was starting to suspect the truth of it was still here, waiting in the walls and floorboards of this place, for someone patient enough, or stubborn enough, to go looking for it properly. She intended to be that person. 3 days felt longer than 3 days. Ruth spent them the way she'd spent every day since arriving, patching, hauling, learning. But underneath the work, the diagram from the fog signal housing sat in her mind like a splinter she couldn't stop worrying at. A square, 3 notches, an arrow toward the base of the tower. On the second day, restless, she stopped treating it as a puzzle to be solved from memory and started treating it like a set of directions. She walked the base of the tower slowly, eyes on the old stonework, running her palm along the mortar joints the way you'd read Braille. Most of it was solid, unremarkable, decades of salt air etched into every seam. But near the north side, low to the ground, half hidden behind a tangle of dead ivy she'd cleared, without really looking at what was underneath it, she found a stone that sat slightly proud of the others. Not by much, a half-inch at most, but enough that her hand caught on the edge of it. She dug the ivy roots away with a garden trowel, hands raw, and worked her fingers into the gap around the stone. It gave, reluctantly, grinding against the mortar that had gone loose around it over the decades, and came free all at once, nearly taking her off balance. Behind it was a cavity, dry despite everything, and inside the cavity, wrapped in what had once been oilcloth and had long since gone stiff and brittle, was a key, small, old-fashioned, exactly the size and shape the second lock in the lamp-room cabinet seemed to want. Ruth sat back on the wet grass and held it in both hands like it might dissolve, and for a moment didn't move at all, just breathed, the bellboy sounding somewhere out past the rocks, the same steady, indifferent rhythm it had kept since her first night here. She climbed the lamp-room stairs faster than she had any of the times before, key gripped so tight it left a mark in her palm, and knelt in front of the cabinet with hands that wouldn't quite hold steady. The small keyhole took the key on the first try and turned, stiff, groaning, but it turned, and the second lock released with a sound like something exhaling after a very long time. The padlock above it still needed force. She'd brought a hammer up from the shed on a hunch, and it took 6 hard swings before the hasp gave way and the cabinet door swung open on hinges that hadn't moved in longer than she'd been alive. Inside, wrapped in oilcloth and old newspaper gone brittle and yellow, were bundles of cash, more money than Ruth had ever seen in one place, banded in stacks that had clearly sat untouched for years, some of the bills old enough that she wasn't sure they were still legal tender. Beneath the cash, in a separate compartment, sat a stack of documents. Deeds, it looked like, and stock certificates, the paper stiff with age, names and figures she'd need better light and steadier hands to make sense of. And beneath all of that, at the very bottom of the cabinet, wrapped separately in a square of oilcloth all its own, was a leather-bound journal. Ruth sat on the gritty lamp-room floor, with the cabinet open in front of her, money and documents she didn't yet understand spread out around her knees, and picked up the journal first, because somehow, without needing to think about it, she understood that whatever the money meant, the journal was the part that actually mattered. The handwriting inside matched the diagram from the fog signal housing, small, careful, deliberate. A man's hand that had clearly spent a long time thinking before it wrote anything down. She opened to the first page. If you're reading this, it means the county finally did what I always suspected they would, and sold this place off to someone with more nerve than sense. Or it means someone in the family finally came looking, which I stopped expecting a long time ago, but never quite stopped hoping for either. Either way, welcome. I'm sorry the roof leaks. I never got around to fixing it properly. The same way I never got around to fixing a lot of things. Ruth's throat went tight. She kept reading. I want to say plainly, before you get any further into this, that the money isn't the point. I know that's an easy thing to write and a hard thing to believe when you're the one kneeling on a cold floor looking at more cash than you've probably ever seen at once. I remember what that felt like, the first time it happened to me, too, a long time ago and a long way from here. But the money was never what this place was for. This place was a foundation, a chance to build something that couldn't be taken away from you the way things were taken from me. If you're the kind of person who ended up here, and something tells me you are, or you wouldn't have made it this far, then you already know the difference between having money and having something solid under your feet. I'm not leaving you the first thing. I'm leaving you the second. She stopped there because her eyes had gone blurred and she needed a minute before she could keep going, and because, sitting on that cold floor with money spread around her and a dead man's handwriting steadying itself in her hands, she understood, for the first time since the letter had found her in a laundromat parking lot 3 weeks ago, that this had never really been about the lighthouse at all. She wiped her face with the back of her wrist and turned the page, and stopped again almost immediately, because the next line began with a name she recognized. Your mother's name was Elaine, and I loved her like she was my own daughter, though I was never given the chance to say so while she was alive to hear it. Ruth's hands went still on the page. She had never told a single person in this town her mother's name. She read the rest of the page twice before she trusted herself to understand it. Elias hadn't just known her mother. He'd raised her, partly, in the years after his sister, Ruth's great-grandmother, had died young and left a daughter no one else in the family had the patience or the money to take in properly. He'd stepped in. He'd been, by his own account, more father to Elaine than anyone else had managed to be, for the better part of a decade. And then I made a mistake with money that wasn't mine to lose, the journal read, and the family decided that mistake erased everything else I'd ever done for her. They took her from me, the way you take something back when you've decided a person doesn't deserve it anymore. I want you to know I never stopped trying to make it right. I want you to know I never stopped loving her, or, once you were born, loving the idea of you, even though I never once got to meet you."
Ruth sat with that for a long time, the lamp room going dim around her as the light outside failed, money and papers still scattered across the floor, forgotten for the moment in favor of the one thing in the cabinet that had actually cost something to give. She didn't finish the journal that night. She told herself it was because the light was gone and her hands had started shaking with cold. But the truth was closer to what it had been the first night at the base of the tower. She wasn't ready yet for whatever came next on the page, and some instinct in her wanted to sit with what she already had before reaching for more. She carried the journal down carefully, left the cash and documents locked back in the cabinet, some caution surviving even through the shock, and slept that night with the journal on the pillow beside her, like something that might need watching. The trouble started 3 days later, and it started the way trouble in an old building usually does. Quietly, in a place nobody was looking. Jean found it first, on the section of roof they'd been circling back to finish, a soft patch near the chimney that gave under his boot, with no warning at all. He caught himself on the ladder rail, swore, and came down slower and greyer than Ruth had ever seen him. "Whole sections rotted through," he said, once he'd caught his breath. "Not just the shingles, the framing underneath. I should have caught it sooner, didn't want to believe it, honestly, given how much of this roof I've already put my hands into." He looked at her, and for the first time since she'd met him, looked genuinely uncertain. "This isn't a patch job anymore, Ruth. This is a section that needs tearing out and rebuilding from the joists up. That's money and time I don't know you've got." She didn't. She had, after finding the cabinet, briefly let herself believe the money problem had solved itself, but the cash in the lamp room was old, some of it possibly no longer usable at face value, and even setting that aside, she understood with a cold, sinking practicality that converting old bills and unfamiliar documents into money she could actually spend on lumber and roofing felt, suddenly, a great deal more complicated than she'd let herself imagine 2 nights ago. "How bad?" she said. "In dollars," Jean told her. And it was bad. Bad enough that she stood on the wet grass afterward and felt, for the first time since arriving, the particular vertigo of watching a solution collapse back into the same problem it was supposed to fix. That night, the rain came again, worse than before, and by morning the soft section of roof had given way outright, opening a hole above the back bedroom that let water pour directly onto the strongbox of old letters she hadn't yet finished reading. She spent the storm's worst hour with a tarp and a ladder in the dark, soaked through, trying to stop damage she wasn't sure she could stop, Jean's warning ringing in her ears the whole time. This isn't a patch job anymore. And somewhere underneath the exhaustion and the cold, a thought she didn't want to have, that maybe she'd taken on more than she could actually hold up, cash cabinet or no cash cabinet, journal or no journal. She got the worst of the letters into a dry box before the damage spread further, though a few of the older receipts were lost to water entirely, and by the time the storm broke toward dawn, she was too tired to do anything but sit on the kitchen floor, with her back against the cabinets, soaked and shaking, the coffee tin of useless keys sitting nearby, like a small monument to every question she still didn't have answered. It was Dot, back from her family emergency and stopping by unannounced the next morning, who found her there. "You look like something the tide dragged in," Dot said, not unkindly, and then took one look at the water-stained ceiling and the tarp still flapping loose above it, and set her bag down without being asked. "All right, tell me what happened," Ruth told her. The roof, the cabinet, the journal, her mother's name in a dead man's handwriting, all of it spilling out faster than she meant it to. 3 weeks of held tension breaking loose at once. Dot listened without interrupting, face going still and careful somewhere in the middle of it, and when Ruth finally ran out of words, Dot was quiet for a long moment before she spoke. "Elaine," she said softly, testing the name like she hadn't said it out loud in a long time. "I wondered,
When you first showed up, something about the way you stood at that gate." She looked at Ruth with an expression Ruth couldn't quite read. Grief, maybe, or recognition, or both at once. "I knew your mother, Ruth, a long time ago, before she left here for good." She paused. "There's more to this than Elias ever told me. But I think it might be time somebody finished the story he couldn't." Dot made tea nobody really wanted, because it was something to do with her hands, and sat across from Ruth at the water-stained kitchen table, with the look of someone deciding, sentence by sentence, how much of a story she was allowed to tell. "Your mother left here when she was about your age now," Dot said. "Maybe a little younger. There was money trouble, real trouble, not the ordinary kind. Elias had put some family savings into a fishing operation with a partner who turned out to be running the whole thing into the ground behind everyone's backs. When it collapsed, there wasn't much left, and what there was, Elias had signed his name to." She wrapped both hands around her mug without drinking from it. The family needed somebody to blame. He was standing closest. "But it wasn't his fault," Ruth said. "The letter. The one I found. It said the money wasn't his doing." "I believe that," Dot said. "I believed it back then too, for whatever that was worth, which wasn't much against a family that had already made up its mind. Elaine was the only one who stood by him at first, wrote to him, visited when she could, until visiting got harder and harder to manage, and then stopped altogether. Not because she stopped caring, from what I understood, but because staying close to Elias meant staying at odds with the rest of the family, and eventually that cost more than she could keep paying." Dot's eyes went distant. "She left the coast not long after. I heard she'd had a baby a few years on. I never put together that the baby was you until you stood in my doorway looking like you'd swallowed a ghost." Ruth sat with that, the tea going cold in front of her, the hole in the roof still dripping faintly somewhere behind them despite the tarp. 11 years since her mother had died, and in all that time, no one, not a single relative, not one of the handful of distant cousins who'd shown up briefly and forgettably at the funeral, had ever once mentioned a great-uncle, a falling out, a lighthouse, a woman named M. It was as if her mother's whole history before Ruth's own memory began had simply been erased, folded up small enough to disappear. "Why wouldn't she ever tell me any of this?" Ruth said, and hated how much it sounded like a child's question. "I couldn't say," Dot said gently. "Grief does strange things to what people pass down. Sometimes silence feels like protection, even when it isn't." She looked toward the water-damaged ceiling. "You've got bigger trouble right now than old history, though. That roof isn't going to fix itself, and from what Jean tells me, you're looking at real money to make it right." Ruth almost laughed, except it wasn't funny. "There's a locked cabinet in the lamp room, with more cash in it than I've ever seen. You'd think that would solve it." "Old bills aren't always worth what people think," Dot said carefully. "And documents that old, deeds and certificates, untangling what's actually still valid, still yours to claim, can take months, and a lawyer you can't afford yet. I'm not saying it's worthless. I'm saying it might not save your roof by next week's rain." That was the problem in its plainest shape, and Ruth spent the rest of the day turning it over while she and Jean stripped the rotted section of roof down to bare joists, working fast against a sky that looked like it meant to open up again by nightfall. By late afternoon, they had the worst of it exposed, enough rot in the framing that Jean went quiet, in a way Ruth had learned to read as worse than his usual complaints. "I'm going to be straight with you," he said, wiping sweat and sawdust off his forehead. "Even if I don't charge you a dime for labor, which I won't, the lumber and materials for a job this size is more than I think you're carrying. And this section's not stable enough to wait on a plan. If it rains hard again before we've got something over it, you could lose the back bedroom floor along with the ceiling. So what do I do?" "Might be time to think about selling some of what's in that cabinet," Jean said. "Even the documents you don't understand yet. There's people who specialize in old certificates, old currency. Buyers, appraisers. Won't get you everything it's worth, probably, moving fast like this. But it might get you a roof before the next storm. It was, Ruth understood, the sensible thing to do, and it made something in her chest go tight and resistant anyway. Because the cabinet wasn't just money anymore. It was Elias's voice, unfinished, and some part of her recoiled at the idea of breaking it apart and selling pieces of it off before she even understood what all of it meant. She climbed the lamproom stairs again that evening, sky already darkening early under a new bank of cloud rolling in off the water, and sat with the journal open on her knees, needing, before she made any decision about the cash or the documents, to hear the rest of what Elias had actually wanted her to know. "I never got the chance to fix things with the family while I was alive," the next entry read, "and I've made my peace with that, mostly. But there's one thing I couldn't let go of, and it's the reason this cabinet exists at all, instead of a bank account like a sensible man would have used. Em told me once that money only means something if it's tied to a place worth standing on." I believed her. I still do. Whatever you decide to do with what's in here, spend it, save it, give it away, I hope you'll keep the light. Not because it's worth anything to anyone else, because it was the one thing nobody could ever take from me. And I'd like to think it can't be taken from you either, as long as you're willing to fight for it. Outside, thunder rolled distant over the water, and the wind picked up against the broken lamproom pane, and Ruth closed the journal with the unmistakable, uneasy sense that whatever choice she made about the cabinet in the next few days, it was going to matter a great deal more than money. The storm that had been building all evening arrived in earnest just past midnight, and it arrived worse than anything the coast had thrown at the lighthouse since Ruth's first night in the driveway. She woke to wind that didn't gust so much as lean, steady and enormous, rattling the boarded window in the cottage until she was sure the board itself would give. Somewhere above the wind, she could hear the tarp over the stripped roof section tearing loose, snapping like a sail, and beneath that, a sound that took her a full, panicked minute to place. Water, moving fast, somewhere it shouldn't be. She found the source in the back bedroom. The exposed joists Jean hadn't finished bracing were taking the rain directly now, the tarp gone entirely, and water was pooling along a beam that ran straight toward the load-bearing wall separating the bedroom from the kitchen. If that wall took on enough water, Jean had told her 2 days ago, half in warning and half in offhand explanation, the whole back corner of the cottage could shift on its foundation. There was no calling Jean at 2 in the morning in a storm like this, no driving anywhere on roads that were already running like creek beds. Whatever happened in the next few hours, she was going to be the one who handled it, alone, with whatever she'd actually learned in the 3 weeks since she'd first stood at the gate, not knowing how to hold a hammer properly. So she worked. She remembered, from watching Jean, how a tarp needed to be tensioned and staked, not just draped. And she found the roll of spare tarp in the shed by phone light, soaked through in seconds hauling it back, and lashed it across the exposed joists, using the technique she'd half absorbed without meaning to, pulling the corners tight to the old chimney flashing the way she'd seen him do a dozen times, without ever once thinking she'd need to do it herself, alone, in the dark, with the wind trying to take the whole sheet out of her hands. It took 4 attempts before it held. Her palms were torn open again by the third, the same blisters she'd earned weeks ago splitting fresh, and somewhere in the second attempt, she was crying without quite noticing she'd started, more from exhaustion and fear than anything else, and she kept working anyway, because stopping wasn't a real option, and never had been, not for her, not in any part of her life she could remember. With the tarp holding, she turned to the water already pooled along the beam, and here she found herself doing something she hadn't expected, thinking not like someone patching a hole, but like someone who'd spent 3 weeks learning how this particular building actually worked. She remembered the well pump outside, remembered the slope of the yard she'd walked 100 times without registering it as useful information, and understood, in a rush that felt almost like the moment the cabinet lock had finally given way, that if she cut a channel along the low side of the exposed subfloor, she could route the water out through the same gap in the foundation stone where she'd found the key, rather than let it pool against the load-bearing wall.
It was crude. It was probably not what Jean would have done, given time and daylight and proper tools. But she did it, chiseling a rough channel with a hand tool from the shed, working by phone light with the storm screaming outside, guiding water that would otherwise have compromised the wall out through the old stone gap instead. And by the time the worst of the storm passed, somewhere past 4 in the morning, the wall had held. She sat on the cottage floor afterward, soaked and shaking and bleeding a little from her palms, and felt something she hadn't expected to feel in the middle of a disaster. Something close to pride, sharp and unfamiliar, sitting right alongside the exhaustion. Jean arrived at first light, expecting the worst, and stood in the doorway of the back bedroom for a long moment, taking in the tarp lashed exactly the way he'd have lashed it himself, and the crude but effective drainage channel cut along the subfloor. "Who taught you to do that?" he said, and it wasn't really a question. "You did," Ruth said. "I just didn't know I'd been paying attention." Something shifted in his face then, some last piece of reserve he'd been carrying since the day they met. She'd noticed it without naming it, the careful, watchful distance he kept, even while helping her, as though he wasn't quite ready to trust that she'd stay long enough to make the help worthwhile. It eased, visibly, standing in that doorway. "I'll say this," he said. "Elias would have been glad to see that. He always said this place tested people before it let them keep it." He looked at her a moment longer. "Looks like it's decided about you." She didn't tell him about the journal entry that had said almost the same thing, word for word, about the light not being able to be taken from someone willing to fight for it. She didn't need to. Standing in the wrecked back bedroom with her hands torn open and the wall still standing behind her, she understood the sentence in a way reading it hadn't managed to teach her. Later that morning, once the worst of the storm cleanup was underway, Dot arrived with a thermos of coffee and news that had clearly been building since the day before. A name, finally, for the woman in the photograph, the woman Elias had called M, the same woman whose letter had spoken of blame and forgiveness and a mistake that wasn't his to carry. Her name was Margaret, Dot said. She ran a little accounting practice in town years back. She's the one who finally figured out what actually happened to that fishing operation's books, years after everyone had already decided Elias was to blame. Dot's face was carefully composed, but something underneath it looked almost relieved to finally be saying this out loud. She proved he hadn't stolen a dime, wrote it all up, sent it to the family herself. She paused. "As far as I know, not one of them ever wrote back."